Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. While there were plenty of constitutional and political events that contributed to the 1975 dismissal crisis, the personalities involved played a big role. A key aspect of the conflict was the relationship between the main protagonists, Kerr and Whitlam. Whitlam had little respect for Kerr, regarding him as weak and easily dominated. Kerr distrusted Whitlam and saw him as a bully and immune from influence or persuasion. There was no relationship of mutual trust and respect between them that could otherwise have headed off any crisis. When it comes to Kerr, the visual image that tends to float into people's minds is of a somewhat inebriated man at the Melbourne Cup wearing tails and carrying a top hat. People think of him as a conservative toff, yet his origins were more working class and more Labor than Whitlam's ever were. Whitlam had been brought up as the son of a senior public servant and lawyer in the suburbs of Kew in Melbourne, Mossman and Turramurra in Sydney, before moving to Canberra, where his father became Crown Solicitor. He also attended some quite expensive private schools, including Knox Grammar in Sydney and Canberra Grammar. He then lived at St Paul's College at the University of Sydney, while studying first for an arts degree and then law. Kerr's background, however, was very different. He was born and brought up in the then working class suburb of Balmain. His father was a boilermaker and his mother had been a dressmaker. His family were Labor supporters who helped campaign for H.V. Evatt's election to the New South Wales Parliament in 1925. Kerr, as a child, was inspired by Evatt to seek entry to Fort Street Boys High School, which Evatt had attended. At the age of 11, Kerr rejected the opportunity to attend the Balmain Trade School and instead sought the permission of his school principal to sit for the high school entrance exam for Fort Street. He won entry to this selective public school and he flourished intellectually. H.V. Evatt gave a prize there each year for the best essay by a boy under exam conditions on a subject that he set. Kerr won that prize in 1931. By then, Australia was gripped by the Great Depression, and unemployment and poverty were rife in Balmain. Kerr's father managed to maintain work as a boilermaker with the railways, but he had to help his unemployed family members and money became very tight. When he left school, Kerr faced a dilemma. He wanted to study law like his hero Evatt, but he couldn't manage to do so financially on a bursary of 8 shillings a week. It made more sense then to go to Teachers' College on a scholarship which would pay more. Having no one to talk to about this dilemma, he looked up Evatt's address in the phone book. Evatt, by that time, was a Justice of the High Court. Evatt's wife, Mary Alice, opened the door to a young John Kerr on her doorstep and explained that Evatt wasn't there, he was at court, but she was sure that he'd see him if he rang to arrange it. Evatt did meet with Kerr and advised Kerr to take up law as he could earn money later during his course by working in a law firm as an articled clerk, which is a kind of legal apprenticeship. But articled clerks usually work for free for the first year of their articles, and Kerr couldn't afford this. So Evatt offered to give Kerr a personal scholarship of £50 a year so that Kerr could support himself and not be a drain on the limited financial resources of his family. Kerr was reluctant at first to accept such generosity, but he was persuaded to do so by his parents. He asked Evatt to limit the scholarship to just 1 year until he could get on his feet financially. Kerr managed to secure articles of clerkship, which, as expected, were unpaid for the first year, but would pay 10 shillings a week thereafter in the following year, with increases of 10 shillings for each year after that. But in 1932, the Lang government was dismissed. See my earlier videos about that. Kerr's father, by this period in the Depression, was getting very limited work as a boilermaker on the railways. The new government then made things worse by reducing the salaries that were paid. Kerr was concerned that he'd have to drop out of law in order to engage in full-time paid work in order to support his family. He explained this to the firm that he was working for and begged them to actually pay him a salary so he could continue with his articles of clerkship. They finally agreed to do that. The combination of Evatt's scholarship, Kerr's bursary, and that the then 12 shillings a week from the law firm that he worked for was enough to support his parents and his siblings. All the money went to his family, with Kerr only keeping enough for his tram fares and his simple lunches. He'd often walk between home and law school just to save the fare. The following year, Kerr was eligible for and won an academic scholarship from the law school. He therefore relinquished the personal scholarship that Evatt had given him, with thanks for supporting him in a time of need. Later in life, Kerr of course became financially well off as a barrister and then a judge, and he also gained connections with Liberal Party figures who courted him to enter politics on their side. But the reason for telling you all of this is that those early experiences of the stress, the tension and the strain of poverty left their mark on Kerr. He knew that were it not for Evatt's kindness and support, he would not have been able to study law and his life would have taken a very different course. He was also acutely aware that decisions made in the world of politics have potentially devastating real-life effects on the lives of working people. For some politicians in 1975, it was a game of power. It was all about smashing the Senate and destroying one's opponents. Few thought about the impact that the government running out of supply would have on those who no longer received their salaries or became unemployed, or the contractors who would go unpaid. Go back to my video on the 19th century precedents in Victoria for a description of how devastating the impact of a government operating without supply can be. And if politicians did think about it, it tended to be in terms of the political impact of public anger. Whitlam's rationale for going to a half-Senate election without supply and intending to govern from November until February at least without supply was that the voters would blame Fraser and the coalition for blocking supply and that Whitlam would therefore gain a political advantage from it. But Kerr had had personal experience of what happened when his father was allocated fewer hours at work and his pay was reduced, and when his uncles became unemployed. He had lived through the Depression and he knew the price that was paid by working people. And now Kerr was the one person who could potentially stop the same consequences befalling others. Now, why do I think he cared about that? It doesn't fit in well with the top hats and the tails and the pomposity that Kerr exuded. Well, it's because quite some time ago, when chatting to some other lawyers, one of them, and I can't remember precisely who it was, but one of them said that he was an associate to a High Court judge at the time of the dismissal. He said that Kerr rang the judge's office to speak to the judge. He explained that the judge was out and said he'd get him to call the Governor-General back. But Kerr wanted to talk. He asked this young man, who was a recent law graduate, whether he was married. Did he have a mortgage? And then came the question that was weighing on Kerr's mind. He asked the associate how he would cope when his salary stopped in the next 2 weeks. This certainly made an impression on me and made me rethink the way I had perceived Kerr. The fact that a Governor-General in the midst of a constitutional crisis would stop to ask a young law graduate who was answering the phone about how he would cope when his salary stopped and what impact it would have on his family says something about how Kerr perceived the crisis and the importance of maintaining supply. Now, I know that many of my viewers will remain committed to believing that everything Kerr did was malevolent and reprehensible, and I do also accept that there's certainly cause to criticise how Kerr handled the crisis, and I will deal with that in later videos. But I think it does help to understand what happens if we can put ourselves in the shoes of the participants and see things from their perspective. I hope this video has given you a different insight into at least one of the concerns that motivated John Kerr in 1975, even if there were a range of other concerns involved too. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and I look forward to seeing you again next time when I address the wargaming that went on in the period leading up to the Coalition's decision to defer the passage of supply. Thank you. See you then. Goodbye.